Ready?
All right, we're rolling.
All right, this is an interview at the New York State Military Museum, Saratoga Springs, New York. It is the 5th of January, 2007, approximately 2:30 p.m. Interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you tell me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
My name is John R. Milanese, Milanese. I was born March 1st, 1925 in Troy, New York.
Okay. What was your educational background prior to entering service?
Well, I was a senior, well actually let me say this here. I had enlisted in November of 1943 when I was still in high school. And I had attended Catholic Central High School in Troy. And when I was enlisted, I had applied for Air Force training in the Navy Air Force. I was not eligible because I had to have a high school degree, high school diploma before I could serve. But I found out that if I had finished high school in 3.5 years and left in January of '42, I would be eligible for the V-12 program. But it necessitated my enrolling in a college and having a first semester completed by July 1, which was the date that I was ordered into service. I enrolled and attended RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute, and by July 1 I'd had my first semester in and therefore qualified for V-12. But I had never thought that I would be sent back to RPI to enroll in V-12 because I had spent my whole educational career by going to grade school, high school, and college and never leaving one city block in the city of Troy. And that was the basis of it. And once I got in V-12, then it progressed into the other service assignments that I had.
Okay. We're going to go back a second. Do you remember where you were when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
I remember I was in front of Hep's Jewelry Store in the city of Troy. I was on my way back from a CYO basketball tournament, which was held at St. Joseph's Church in South Troy. And I remember it so vividly. By the time I got home, my brother-in-laws were already talking about what they would do about entering the service. And of course at that time, it was a vision more than anything else, but I remembered like it was yesterday.
Now you enlisted in the Navy. Why did you select the Navy?
Well, actually what had happened prior to that, I had made application for both West Point and Annapolis, and found that I couldn't get the appointment. Somebody else got the appointment, and there's sort of a story about who did get the appointment, which we'll discuss later. And I then decided that if there was any possibility, I had a better chance of getting in Annapolis than I could getting into West Point, because that assignment had been pretty much locked up. And that's why I picked the Navy at the time, and got into the V-12 program. And the problem with being in the V-12 program and being stationed at RPI and being in my hometown, I'd had so many friends that were in active duty that it preyed upon my mind that I should be safe in a college atmosphere. And 9 months before I could have got commissioned, I applied for active service and went right through the boot training program. The coincidence about the Annapolis appointment that I got out of the service in March of 1946, and the following July I received communications that if I wanted to reapply, I would be eligible in attending Annapolis. But I was 21 then. You know, too many years had passed. I'd been away too long, and your priorities change a little.
Now, when you left the V-12 program and you said you went to basic, where did you go for that?
I went to Great Lakes, and from Great Lakes I was I was stationed at Norman, Oklahoma in Ordnance School. And from Norman, I anticipated going to Purcell to gunnery school as an aerial gunner. Unfortunately, I developed pharyngitis the 2 weeks before my graduation with my class and was held over. And by the time I finished to be transferred, my class had already proceeded to Purcell. So I was transferred to North Island. And from North Island, I went by carrier to Pearl Harbor and more directly to Ford Island. And from Ford Island, I was stationed at Ford Island for, I think about 6 months, doing the maintenance control on firing power for aircraft stationed on the various aircraft carriers that were in there for rehabilitation.
Now, when was it when you reached Ford Island?
I got to, well, let me see, I think I got to Ford Island in November of '44. And from Ford Island, I was then shipped to, transferred because I became a replacement, and went to a small man-made island that was an incredible piece of real estate. It was 1 mile long, 1/4 mile wide, and it was called Johnston Island. And it resembled an aircraft carrier in its structure and used to drive everybody crazy because they couldn't positively define it as a stationary landing slip, and became a problem when they were approaching for draft and downwind.
No, where was this located?
This was southwest of Honolulu. It was approximately 2,200 miles, and actually what it was a fueling station for all aircraft coming from the flight areas into the Honolulu United States panels.
Now, when you were at Ford, was there much debris left there from the attacks?
Actually, Ford Island, and I never knew this at the time I was stationed there. When I was at Ford Island, I was originally assigned to boat ordnance, and then from boat ordnance I was assigned to run the flight control desk. And strange part about it is your training was they handed you a code book and told you everything that came in was going to be in code, and you had to figure it out for yourself. But what we had was underground bunkers, and for all the time I was there, I thought these bunkers were really the storage areas for military armament, bombs and so on. It wasn't until some years later that I found out that what we were storing was all the nerve gas in the Pacific. In fact, Johnston Island, a year and a half ago, was completely demolished and quarantined for the next 50 years because they found that the island was contaminated because of 2 aborted atomic research programs that were conducted there. When the war ended, we had somehow been indicated that we would survey as much ammunition and material that we had stored there because everybody thought we were really going to go to war with Russia. And it was a very strategic location, and that's when we started to survey every piece of equipment we could. And as I found out later, what I was handling was nerve gas, and I always thought that they were nothing more than 300-pound bombs.
Now, what duties did you perform on Ford Island and Johnston Island? What were some of the specific things?
Well, as I told you, I was originally in boat ordnance,
Mm-hmm.
and most of the assignments I had was the rebuilding, maintenance, and improving of any firepower that we had on the island. But then when I got up into the front desk of the flight control division, it was merely arranging for all arrivals and departures scheduled, and maintaining any personnel that came through, because we would customarily be a stopover for all hospital patients that were being flown back to the States.
Okay. When you were on Johnston Island, how large was the crew or the staff that was
We
there?
had less than 100, and it was a combined force of Marines, Seabees, Navy, and Army. And the island was a mile long and a quarter mile, and would constantly have to be watered and maintained because it was being constructed of coral. It's a very interesting thing that while I was at Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute, I had a roommate whose name was Dr. George Lowe. And Dr. George Lowe became Deputy Director of NASA and was responsible for the shot to the moon. And George has since passed away. But about 10 years ago, I was listening to television and heard something about that the shuttle capsules were capable of photographing certain spots and so on. So I called Langley, introduced myself as having known George, and it opened up a couple of doors. And they had arranged to photograph Johnston Island from space, and they were good enough to send me a copy of that particular photograph. And it was so interesting to find that the contour of the island had not changed from the original mapping.
Now, what kind of structures did you live in on this island?
It was all Quonset huts, and it was not unusual to lose a Quonset hut every now and then when you had a good storm come through.
I was just going to say that.
But I have sort of a pictorial presentation, if anybody wanted to look at it, that will show you what kind of primitive condition. In fact, Ernie Pyle passed through at one time and wrote an article. I wish I could redeem it, because he called it probably one of the most lonely, desperate spots in the world. We were isolated, and as I say, just a small contingent, and didn't have an awful lot of communication with the outside world other than planes that came in, landed, and took off again.
Now, did you have storage area for planes on the island, or?
No, everything was wide. The only buildings on the island were Quonset huts for residents, a mess hall, a storage warehouse, and as I told you, each particular segment of the service had their own little colony set up.
What did you do for entertainment there?
The island was completely covered with goonie birds, and that's about the entertainment. In fact, being in Saratoga today was quite a good remembrance that Bernie Collins, who used to have a local orchestra, came through with a CYO tour one time, and it was just great talking to him. Bernie, after the war, became head of security at the SPAC, and his son ran a restaurant, Collins, on Route 9, and I think it's still there today.
Now, did you have movies that you got to see?
They had movies, but they were more the repeat of the same movie rather than new movies. And I think during the time that I was there, we probably had 2 USO units that came through and visited with us.
Were they any big names, or were they just?
No, they were. Bernie Collins was the biggest name that passed through.
What was it? You must have gotten to know everybody there pretty well. Did you make any close friendships while you were there?
You know, the coincidence of it is that I have only been able to locate one person that was still on the island when I was there. And he's a young man that lives in New Mexico who was with the CB unit. But the island had so few people of similar service orientation, such as Navy and so on and so forth, that you never really got to know anybody that well, because somebody was always being transferred out. The majority of the people who worked with me were from the Chicago area. And I did get in touch with them a couple of times, but when you don't have that many, it's not like serving in a unit where you have a whole company or a division.
How long were you on Johnston Island?
I was on Johnston Island for, I would say, 18 months, interrupted by a hospital stay in Aiea.
No, what had happened to you that you...
I had been diagnosed with skin cancer. That was a very frightening thing, being young and have somebody tell you. And finally, when I got to the hospital, they had found out that it wasn't really skin cancer, but my shoulders had reacted from firing 20 millimeters. And what had happened was it had stretched and scarred my armholes. And but they did follow up on it, and they found that it was not. If it was non-malignant.
Did you or any of the fellows that were stationed with you, did they ever come down with anything like malaria or any sort of tropical
No, in
illnesses?
fact, Johnson was 3 degrees off the equator. It was always, well, our temperature ran like 110 degrees, 115 degrees. But the amazing part about it is that the air constantly moving over the island and the temperatures never varying created sort of a healthy atmosphere. And the amount of people that flew through that may have been contaminated and so on were so isolated for the period of time they were there that there wasn't much occasion. In fact, remarkably, when I think of it now, I don't think I was ever sick while I was on Johnston Island until that little deal I had where I went up to Aiea Hospital.
Now, did you have, you must have had electric generators there? What supplied your power?
Yes.
You must have...
Everything was generator control. In fact, we had an excellent CB unit attached to us. The original CB unit were the ones that started to construct the island and maintained it over the course of years. But the thing that is amazing is that, as I mentioned before, a year and a half ago, when they quarantined the island for 50 years, to think that nobody is allowed to go back there, and every rising structure was leveled right to the ground.
Okay. Do you have any other interesting stories that you want to mention we haven't covered?
Well, you know, you look back and you think of from 1943 to 1946, and on March 27th is when I was discharged. It's hard to remember every day, but it's hard to forget every day. I don't know if that makes sense to you or not, because you think of your life in snippets. I think the most important thing about being in the service at the time was the uncertainty of where you were going to be sent, and being in a unit that replaced service personnel. You never traveled with the same people. You were always designated as an independent reserve and replacement. When you talk about the interesting things that happen when you're in the service, I think the interesting things are the people that I have met and known. In fact, when I was at Norman, I ran into a friend of mine from Lansingburg, New York, whose name was Bernie Schlesinger. Professionally, he is Frank Schlesinger. And Bernie and I were together at Norman, and we were going to be transferred out together, except that I developed this pharyngitis. He came to the East Coast, I went to the West Coast. And I hadn't seen Bernie in, possibly 30 years, and then when I finally contacted him, we had some brief opportunity to keep in touch with each other, but about 2 years ago, he was passing through and we visited, and I got the surprise of my life when I found out that he was named one of the 40 leading architects in the world, and that he was on his way to a presentation at the Capitol for a review of the work that he had done. While in the service, I knew Alan Voorhees, who was one of the first scuba, what am I thinking of, the underwater team.
Oh, underwater demolition teams.
And he later became the chief architect of the arterial system of Australia. And the last time I saw him was at a reunion at RPI where he had just purchased and dedicated the library. And if I were to bring Alan in, well, he's since dead, by the way, if I were to bring him in and we would sit here together, you'd wonder, who is that person? I mean, he'd say few words, but he was very capable and very talented. Living with George Low was an experience when he became deputy director of NASA. And the coincidence was that I was in Washington. I had, during the period of 1964 to 68, I became executive vice president of the Home Builders Association. And I was lobbying in Washington, and one night we went to dinner, and there was a banquet of the outstanding young men in government service. And I overheard a conversation where somebody said that they were just going to pick this young man who was honored that night to replace another person by the name of Charlie Matthews, who was deputy director of NASA. And Charlie was being replaced because of the fatality of the 3 astronauts that were burned in the capsule. And the coincidence was that Charlie Matthews was my brother-in-law's roommate at RPI, and George Low would be my roommate at RPI. Small world.
Yes. After you left service, did you make any use of the GI Bill?
Yes, I finished college under the GI Bill at RPI.
Okay. Did you join any veterans organizations?
No, I didn't. I didn't. I probably had thought about it, but never got around to it. But I did have a lad that worked for me who was instrumental in creating the Flag Day parade in the city of Troy. And we participated with them on many occasions, supporting the efforts.
How do you think your time in the service had an effect on your life?
Oh, it had a definite effect. First of all, anybody that went in at 17 and came out at 21 never realized what they missed until later on in life when they saw their offspring going through those stages. But I can't explain it. It was, not only did you join because you felt it was your obligation to defend your country, it was almost that you had to join to allow your family to pay back what this country had done for them. And that's basically the origin of the service. I never regret having been in the service, and yet I sometimes wonder what it would be like if I had a son and he were in the service today. I'm not so sure how I would really think about that.
Mm-hmm.
But I commented to somebody the other day that I read a letter that I wrote to my father in 1944 when I complained about the boredom of being out in the Pacific. And he wrote and said, "Someday you will wish you were back out there." I know just what he means.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your interview.
Well, thank you.